We're gathering this week at what can only be described as a very difficult time for our provincial labor movement. The government that we helped elect in 2015 and which we worked so closely with over the past 4 years to make historic gains for working people, that government has been defeated. We are now facing the prospect of battles on multiple fronts. Over the next few weeks and months, we will face aggressive legislative attacks on workers' rights, including the right to organize, the right to bargain, and even the basic right to speak out and advocate on behalf of the working people who we represent. We will also face attacks on education, healthcare, and other public services as the new government implements deeper cuts than we've seen in this province since the darkest days of the Klein years. We will face a wave of privatization and deregulation that will undermine protections for citizens and perhaps will also open the door to US-style health care. And we will face attacks on our retirement security as the government seeks to undermine the mechanisms that allow workers to save effectively and efficiently for their own retirement. So in many ways, these are dark days. But before we contemplate just how dark they are, and before we start the conversation about how to respond to our province's new political reality, I think it's important for us to spend at least a little bit of time reminding ourselves of who we are as a labor movement. Specifically, we need to remind ourselves about what we've been able to accomplish over the past 4 years with a worker-friendly government, and we also need to remind ourselves what we were able to accomplish during the 20 years before that under governments that were decidedly not labor-friendly. We need to remember these accomplishments, both under labor-friendly governments and governments that are not friendly. We need to remember those accomplishments and victories, not only to alleviate the disappointment that we feel about the election, but perhaps more importantly, we need to look back on our past to draw lessons and find inspiration that will strengthen us and give us hope and direction in the battles that lie ahead. So let's start with the past 4 years. When we cast our eyes back to 2015, what should we remember? Well, we should remember that the NDP victory would not have been possible without the support and hard work of working people, including many people in this room. We made history. Even more importantly, we should remember that this was a government made up of nurses and teachers and tradespeople and retail workers, in other words, ordinary Albertans. Ordinary Albertans who proved that ordinary could be extraordinary. People like Daniel Larrivee, the UNA president from Slave Lake, who became Minister of Child Services and brought us $25 a day daycare, a program that transformed the lives of thousands of Alberta families. This is the kind of thing that we've been able to accomplish. People like Shannon Phillips, the Unifor member and former AFL research director who became the Minister of Environment and brought us a climate leadership plan that balanced concerns about climate change with concerns about jobs and the economy, and which became a blueprint and inspiration for governments across the country and around the world. These are our people. People like Shay Anderson, better known as the Beard. Shay was a steel worker and TELUS installer who became the Municipal Affairs Minister and brought us a better financial deal for cities, towns, and municipalities. People like Brian Mason, the ATU activist and former bus driver who became infrastructure minister and brought us an unprecedented building program that gave us much needed new schools, roads, hospitals, and which kept thousands of tradespeople working while oil prices were low, and that made it harder for them to find work in the oil and gas sector. And of course, there was Premier Rachel Notley herself, a former lawyer, but also a former labor relations officer with the United Nurses of Alberta, who as Premier, helped put the values and principles that animate our labor movement at the heart of her government, and who passed a law that gave independent governance to our public sector pension plans so that people who pay for those plans can make sure that they keep doing that job of providing retirement security for Albertans without political interference from future Conservative governments. But as all of us know, those weren't the only Labour people in that government. There were people like Heather Sweet and Nicole Goring from AUPE, Barb Miller from UFCW, John Carson from IBEW, Ricardo Miranda from CUPE, Maria Fitzpatrick from PSAC, Eric Rosendahl from Unifor, and two of my favorites, Craig Coulahan from the Utility Workers and Cam Westhead from the United Nurses of Alberta, who were both fantastic, hard-working constituency MLAs who came so close to winning re-election just 2 weeks ago. And of course, there were the MLAs who weren't originally from Labour, but who became part of our Labour family. That list is long, but I have to mention three by name. The first was Jessica Littlewood, the MLA for Fort Saskatchewan, who basically adopted all the tradespeople and federal workers and refinery workers in her riding, and in the process became a fierce advocate for workers' rights. The second was Marc Mcquaid Boyd, the college administrator from Fairview who became energy minister and who worked with us to develop a plan for adding value to our resources so we could create upgrading, refining, and petrochemical jobs in places like Fort Saskatchewan, Edmonton, and Fort McMurray, instead of shipping those jobs down the pipeline to places like the U.S. Midwest and the U.S. Gulf Coast. And last, but certainly not least, there was Christina Gray. The small business owner and IT geek who became the best damn Labour minister that our province has ever seen. Christina's in the room. Could everyone just turn around? Christina, could you stand, please? So as minister, Christine was smart, she was thoughtful, she was accessible, she was fair. She took the time to master her file, to consult, and to get the details right. Working with us and our affiliates and other members of civil society, she brought us the $15 minimum wage that helped pull thousands and thousands of working Albertans out of poverty. She brought us a new occupational health and safety code that gives workers the right to refuse unsafe work, the right to know about safety hazards in their workplace, and the right to participate in making rules to keep themselves and their co-workers safe at work. She brought us pay-at-the-pump rules that have virtually eliminated gas and dash-related attacks against gas station attendants and saved lives in the process. She brought us a new WCB Act that put the priority on helping injured workers instead of on keeping premiums low for employers. And of course, she worked with us to bring in a new labor code that supports the right of workers to organize and bargain collectively, and a new employment standards code that finally gives Alberta workers the same kind of protections in the workplace that other Canadians have enjoyed for decades. Now, when it comes to labor law and workplace protections, moving into the Canadian mainstream may not sound like a radical concept, but when you've been so far behind that mainstream for so long, moving there was like a quantum leap forward, and Christina did that. So, what does this long list of people and accomplishments show us? Well, it shows us that it matters who we elect, and that for working people, it's worth fighting to elect people who share our values and priorities. It also shows us that governments don't have to be made up of bosses and lawyers who work for bosses. They can also be made up of nurses and teachers and tradespeople and retail workers. And you know what else the experience of the last 4 years shows us? It shows us not only that working people can win election, but that they can also govern, and that they can govern well. Now, I'm not going to sugarcoat things, because of course, a lot of what was accomplished by the Notley government with our support and our consultation will be dismantled. Our new Premier says this summer will be the summer of repeal, and I take him at his word. But what we've learned as a result of our experience over the past 4 years is that working people don't have to take a back seat. Alberta is no longer a one-party state. We can elect governments that really see working people, that respect us, and that embrace our values and priorities. So if we've won once, we can win again. And if we built once, we can build again, and we can build even better. So this morning and this week, I want us to remember that all that we've accomplished over the past years, we have to remember those accomplishments and those victories, and let that memory give us hope for the future. But as I mentioned, I also want us to remember that this is the labor movement, we know a thing or two about surviving, and yes, even thriving under hostile conservative governments. So, we've been focused on the last 4 years, quite rightly, but this is also the labor movement that fought back and won when Ralph Klein tried to bring American-style right-to-work laws to Alberta in the 1990s. This is also the labor movement that made Ralph Klein blink when he said that he wouldn't, when he was hacking and slashing our support for our public services. This is the labor movement that said no way to the so-called third way that would have brought two-tier American-style health care to Alberta. And of course, most recently, this is the labor movement that stood up to Alison Redford and stopped her when she tried to gut our public sector pension plans. That's who we are. What our experience under premiers like Ralph Klein, Ed Stalmach, and Alison Redford shows is that the labor movement can be a real force to be reckoned with, even if we don't have the ear of the people in power. What our experience shows is that we can be creative and persuasive and forceful, and that we can win even when the deck is stacked against us. So we can do all of these things because we have a secret weapon that they can never take away from us. And that secret weapon is each other. Solidarity, creativity, passion, it's what got us through the 90s and the early 2000s, and it's what's going to get us through the next 4 years. I would even go so far as to say if there was ever a labor movement that was up for the challenges that we will be presented by the Kenney government, it's this labor movement. Some may say, whoa, Gil, let's wait. Let's see how things go with this new government, and let's try to get to know them. And so I'm going to make this commitment to you as your president. I will do all of those things that advocacy groups do with new governments. We're going to ask for meetings. We're going to attempt to get to know the new Premier, his ministers, and their senior staff. We're going to lobby. We're going to write briefs. We'll participate in consultations in good faith. But we have to be realistic. We have to acknowledge that this government is a new kind of conservative government. It's a government that will have, and I would argue already has, more in common with American Republicans in the mold of Donald Trump than they do in common with traditional Canadian conservative parties. Now, the American poet Maya Angelou wrote, "When somebody shows you who they really are, believe them the first time." The UCP has shown us who they really are. They ran on a platform in this election campaign characterized by an orthodox right-wing menu of policies: tax breaks for corporations, budget cuts and privatization for public services, weakening of rules designed to protect consumers, workers, and the environment, and efforts to weaken the power of working people and the unions that represent them. But that wasn't all. They also added a healthy dose of climate change denial, social conservatism, and weaponized anger and intolerance as a core political strategy. That is the new conservative movement in Alberta. And so we know what they're going to do in terms of policy, and we know what they're also going to do in terms of strategy. So the legislature is going to be reconvened soon. The throne speech will be delivered on May the 22nd, which is really just a few weeks from now. And the Premier has already indicated that he will move hard and fast to implement his policies in order to make it difficult for opposition to organize. He's told us that his first bill introduced in this new legislature will be to get rid of the Alberta carbon tax, which, by the way, will be replaced immediately by the federal carbon tax. But the next piece of legislation, Bill 2, will be what they call the Open for Business Act, which will include an all-out attack on workers' rights and worker bargaining power. In addition, they've announced that in the fall, they will bring in a new budget. And if this budget, as we expect it will, is based on the platform that they released during the election, it will include a 15% cut in per capita spending on public services, which represents deeper cuts to public services in this province than we've seen since the dark days of the Klein era. In addition, these people are campaigners, and they are aggressive campaigners. So they will use poll-tested language and tactics to demonize and marginalize opponents, including us. And here's the reality. Traditional lobbying efforts, efforts to build relationships with the new government will not deter them from their policy goals. Playing nice won't stop what's coming. It won't even soften the blow. So starting today and continuing for the rest of this week, as we lead up to the upcoming session of the legislature, we have to prepare for a fight. Now, so what is that fight going to look like? Over the next 4 years, there are at least 5 things that I suggest that we have to do. The first is that we need to debunk what I call the 3 big lies. Now, with Jason Kenney, and I think most of us followed the campaign, there were many lies, in some cases too many to count, but I identify 3 big ones that are pivotal to the future of our province and to the interests of the people we represent. The first lie has to do about the economy, in particularly the oil and gas economy. In this campaign, Jason Kenney told a story about what's happening to the Alberta economy. He said that we're struggling and jobs are being lost because of the policies of the Notley government and the policies of the federal Liberal government, And also, for good measure, he threw in this notion that we are victims of an aggressive advocacy campaign funded by foreign-funded environmentalists. Now, I want to make it really clear that the challenges that we face have nothing to do with the things that he just talked about. It is true that we have an economy that relies extensively on the oil and gas sector. It is the engine of our economy. But there are many healthcare workers in the room, and you will acknowledge that if you want to provide the right prescription for an ailment, you have to have the right diagnosis. And I'm going to submit to you today, as I did throughout the entire campaign, that Jason Kenney and the UCP have the wrong diagnosis of the problem. When it comes to job loss, lack of investment, and all the associated struggles that we've been facing in the oil and gas sector, what's really driving this is what can only be defined as a profound transformation in the global oil and gas economy. That transformation starts with the fracking and horizontal drilling boom in the United States, which has turned our biggest customer. 99% of our oil exports go to the American market, but as a result of fracking, our biggest customer has become our biggest competitor. That transformation continues with the way that oil companies here in Alberta and around the world are responding to that change. And they're responding to this low price environment created by the fracking boom by reducing their costs, by using automation and technology to get rid of workers and jobs. So even if investment comes back, there's not a guarantee that jobs will follow. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, the third dimension of this sweeping transformation that is affecting all oil-producing jurisdictions of the world, not just Alberta, has to do with the fact that the world has started that long, bumpy process of moving away from fossil fuels. So it's not going to happen next week or next month or even next year, but all the forecasts are that demand for oil will peak within the next 10 years and start to decline as the world starts getting serious about climate change. That means that the world, our customers, are going to be looking for less of what we're selling. And so this election, and this is what we said in our campaign leading up to the election, this election really should have been about preparing for change. But instead, it became a campaign about pointing fingers and stoking anxiety, fear, and anger. So that's the first lie. The second lie that needs to be debunked has to do with this notion, deeply held by many voters in this province, that conservatives have the better answers for the economy. And this is a notion that we have to address as a labor movement, because if it goes unaddressed, we're the ones who pay the price. So what Albertans have been told, and what we heard during the election campaign, is that there's a simple formula for bringing prosperity and investment back to Alberta. And it's that old menu of conservative policies. Tax breaks for corporations and the wealthy, cuts to public services, deregulation, and if you do these things, investment and jobs are supposed to come back. But here's the truth. Here's the truth about that lie. This is a formula that has been tried before. This is a menu that has been implemented in jurisdiction after jurisdiction, not only across Canada, but indeed across the world over the last 40 years. And instead of bringing us the shared prosperity that people like Jason Kenney promise, it has brought us stagnation, slower economic growth, rising inequality, crumbling public services. That is what the right-wing menu gives us. And that's what was offered to us. But what we need to do is to talk to people about the real track record of the right-wing menu, and we have to convince more people that it's snake oil and that it's something that we should not continue to swallow. The third big lie that we have to debunk has to do with us, with the labor movement. So we heard a lot about the first two lies in the election campaign, right? What was really ailing our oil and gas economy and how Jason Kenney's prescriptions were the right way to go in terms of creating jobs and bringing back investment. But the third lie is the one that is yet to be told, but we're going to start hearing very soon. And that is the lie that Jason Kenney and his ministers and their surrogates are going to start repeating over and over again, starting perhaps 2 weeks from now when they begin the legislature, and that is the lie that unions are bad for workers and that they're bad for the economy. And they're going to spin this story, and they're going to tell these lies in order to justify their attacks on labor law and the laws that allow us to bargain, to organize, bargain collectively, and to represent our members. And so we have to tell the story about how unions are actually the bedrock and the cornerstone of a middle-class society, and that when you attack unions, you attacked the very nature of a middle-class society. So we have to be prepared to tell that story. So that's the first thing that we have to do. We have to debunk what I call the three big lies. The second thing that we need to do is defend the things that we value, and defend them with the vigor and the energy and the enthusiasm that I've seen from this labor movement before. So we need to defend our public services. We need to defend workers' rights. We need to defend the right to dissent, to hold differing points of view. We need to defend a tolerant and inclusive society, which, as we saw over and over again during the election campaign, is under attack. The third thing that we have to do, and we've done this well in the past, we need to build alliances and build coalitions with other groups that share our values and our priorities and are concerned about what the conservative agenda will do to those values and priorities. So we need to reach out to seniors and students and faith groups, the LGBTQ plus community, immigrant groups. And yes, we need to continue building on that relationship with the NDP now that they're in opposition. And we need to find hope and strengthen each other, and we need to make a difference through collective action. The fourth thing that we need to do is to build a vision, an alternative narrative, an alternative vision to the one that's being presented by Jason Kenney. Because as we saw during this election campaign, they have a story to tell. And they have a strategy for motivating people. They motivate people by stoking anxiety and filling people with anger. And we need to respond to that by motivating people with hope. And the key to that is to present an alternative story and an alternative vision that inspires that kind of hope. So later in this convention, I think it might even be as early as today, we are going to be presenting you with what we call the 12-point labor vision for the future. And it is just that kind of hopeful vision that I'm talking about. And I'm not saying that it's the be-all and end-all, and we're going to have to sit down with our coalition partners. But it's a vision that we describe as our progressive high road as opposed to the conservative low road. So when they say that we should cut public services and those services that support people and communities, we say that we should invest in people and those services that support communities. When they say that we should double down on an industry that is perhaps in decline, we say we should diversify. And that's the kind of vision that we need to build that will inspire people, offer a clear alternative, and hopefully motivate more people to get involved in this progressive coalition that we have to build, not only in hopes of electing another government 4 years from now, but more importantly, to motivate people to come together to fight back against the worst of the conservative agenda in the meantime. And finally, the fifth job that we have to do, and I would actually argue in some ways this is the most important job, is that we have to convince our fellow working people in this province that they've been misled. And this is a hard thing for us to admit, but it's something that we can't afford to ignore. Jason Kenney assembled a coalition in order to win the majority government that he just won. And that coalition includes support from an awful lot of angry working people. And so our unique responsibility, and I would argue our opportunity, is to speak to those working people. I would argue that there is no other group in society that is better placed to talk to those angry working people than our hopeful working people like yourselves in this room. During the election campaign, Jason Kenney said that he would be laser focused on jobs, pipelines, and the economy. But the truth is that what he was really laser focused on was stoking anger and anxiety and fear to advance his own political agenda. And that laser focus, that strategy, was focused on a lot of people like ourselves. Working people from public and private sector in all walks of life, some of them in unionized workplaces, some of them in non-unionized workplaces. But in order to change things and to defend the things that we value, we have to find a way to talk to our fellow working people, to go to them where they are at. And frankly, it is a place of anger and anxiety right now. And we need to validate that anger. It may be hard for us to do in some cases, but we need to validate that anger, speak to them on terms that resonate with them, and convince them that there is a better, more hopeful way for our province and our country. And I would just reiterate that I don't think that there's anyone, any group in our society that is better placed to do that job. It is, we have the most to gain by being successful in that work, and I would argue we also have the most to lose. So this week, we are going to start work on all of those fronts by engaging in debate on resolution and hearing from speakers. So for example, later today, we're going to hear from energy journalist Marc on his take on what's really happening in our oil and gas economy. And he's going to talk about the new book that he's written, which is kind of provocative because it acknowledges this energy transformation that I just mentioned. And he actually goes further to say that after interviewing all sorts of experts in oil and gas, in academia, economists, he's come to the conclusion that the policies that the Notley government had in place are exactly the kind of policies that we need to guide an oil-producing jurisdiction like us through this very challenging transition. So we're going to hear that from him this afternoon. We're also going to hear about the economic high road versus economic low road policies and why conservatives are really not that good at the economy when it comes to creating jobs and creating shared prosperity. So we're going to hear stories from a speaker who has written about that right-wing menu of policies and what it's meant for working people in American states like Kansas and Oklahoma. We're also going to hear a presentation from labor economist Jim Stanford, who has honestly spent most of his life talking about the importance of moving to these high road policies that put people at the center of the equation as opposed to narrow interests of the business community. We're also going to look back in history. So we have speakers here with experience from Europe and the UK who will share lessons about dealing with conservative governments in that part of the world. We've also have speakers from the United States, the labor movement in the United States, to talk about how they are dealing with dealing with the challenges presented by Trump's America. And closer to home, we'll have a speaker from Ontario to talk about what the labor movement is doing there to deal with Doug Ford, their premier, who, as Jason Kenney said, is so much like Jason Kenney that they finish each other's sentences. So we're hoping that we can learn lessons from them. So in conclusion, at this convention, we're here to build bonds of solidarity that will sustain us in the fights to come. We're here to make plans that will make us more effective in those fights. But we're also here to send a message to the new government and to put the new premier on notice. And our message for them is manifold. We're sending the message that we will not sit idly by while they lie to working people and attempt to exploit their fears and anxieties for political gain. We will not sit idly by while they pretend that their government is the real voice of working people. We will assert that role for ourselves. We will not sit idly by while they undermine our vital public services and open the door for American-style health care. We will not sit idly by while they go after our pensions and our retirement security. We will not sit idly by while they suppress wages and worker bargaining power, the things that are necessary to build a healthy middle class. We won't sit idly by while they give us, while they take unnecessary and I can't even read my own handwriting. While they give unnecessary and irresponsible tax breaks to corporations and in the process create deficits that will lead to mass layoffs and mass service cuts. We will not sit idly by while they use the smokescreen of, quote, red tape reduction to gut the rules that protect consumers and workers and the environment. We won't sit idly by while they ignore the real challenges facing our oil and gas economy and refuse to prepare us as a province for the change that is so clearly coming our way. And finally, we will not sit idly by while they try to undermine the ability of working people to organize and advocate for their own members on the political stage. So, with that, let's start the work at this convention, the work that will help prepare us for the fights that lie ahead, and let's show Premier Kenney and his cabinet that he's picking a fight with the wrong labor movement.